Now, this is one of the critical aspects that is unbeknown to many of us in here. The monarchists could not confront the nationalists because they lacked an ideological base. You can't go to the people and say, we need to defend the society because I am the king and I own all of you, and the resources in here is for the best interest of the monarchy and the best interest of the royal family. Aside from only the prince and princess who never fought a war in their life, no one will actually rally to their support. We needed an ideological line. This ideological line was to use traditional Islam, to mobilize Islamic tendencies, to say that the Arab nationalists lack religious credentials. They were basing their identity on ungodly socialism. Does it sound familiar? Their ideas are vested in support from the Soviet Union, from communism. And therefore, they lack the roots of Arab society, which is vested in Islam. So between the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, our foreign policy leaned on encouraging Muslim movements, as a way to check the nationalist, to check the socialist. And if you look in Egypt, for example, the nemesis for Nasser were the Brotherhood movement. The nemesis for Nasser was the Brotherhood movement. And he actually hanged the leader of the Brotherhood movement, Sayyid Qutb, in 1964. For us, that was a major crisis because the Saudis were at odds and confronting the Egyptians. And they confronted the Egyptians in Yemen. There was a long-standing war in Yemen between the Saudis, who are representing the monarchies, and the Egyptians, who were representing the nationalists. So that was a war being fought, and Islam was introduced as a way to give legitimacy to the monarchies that were lacking any ideological legitimacy. Therefore, they leaned on Islam as a way to try to confront, to check, and to neutralize the nationalist movements who were beginning to threaten, from their perspective, from the monarchy's perspective, their own stability. Now, why would the Saudis be concerned? Now, if you look at Saudi Arabia, which is our gas stations, right? If you look at Saudi Arabia, it has the largest oil reserve in the world. It does not have a high population density. It does not have an army. Right? In terms of its security, it has no standing army to speak of. For the longest period of time, the Saudis will actually bring in units from other countries to do rotation. So they'll bring a unit from Jordan, 10,000, to do a 6 months or a year rotation. They'll bring a unit from Pakistan. They'll bring a unit from Indonesia, and they do a rotation. So it lacks the army infrastructure. Egypt, on the other hand, has a large population. Now it's almost reaching 80 million. At the time, it was about 40 million. High density, high population, large army, very well-established society. Even if you go back to the era before the pharaohs, Egypt is a very well-established society. So from their point of view, that if nationalism succeeds in Egypt, succeeds in Syria, succeeds in Iraq, this will result that their thrones will be undermined, and more so that they're sitting on the primary resource that keeps the global economy moving. So they had a vested interest in checking out and keeping the nationalist movements in check, and they leaned on the Islamic movements in particular to try to offset the nationalists. Now, this structure became very problematic in 1979. Now, 1979 is a watershed point for U.S. foreign policy as well as for the Cold War in the Arab world. 1979, you have the Iranian Revolution, right? The Iranian Revolution, where the Shah, who constituted one of the U.S. foreign one of the pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and the second was Saudi Arabia. The Persian structure provided the military power and might, and the Saudis provided the resources. So 79, you have the Iranian Revolution, a Shia state emerging with very strong Shia credentials. You don't have more than to look at the Ayatollah to recognize that this is a religious figure with religious credentials. So that provided a crisis. At the same time, you had the Soviets invading Afghanistan. So you had two major crises to the structure of our foreign policy. Now, aside from what you think, the U.S. is the only superpower, right, that is able to maneuver around the global political arrangements. You could say it's the heartland periphery. You could say, in some sense, those who like the godfather figure, you could say that the U.S. constitutes itself as the godfather of foreign policy structures. In a literal sense, you have these dynamics, and you have a major crisis to the structure. Now, from the U.S., this is a crisis to the main area where our national security is vested in oil. 70% of the oil resources are found in that area. Between Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, that's the hub of the oil reserves for the global economy and the world market. If Iran collapses, and you have the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, the threat was that the Soviet might penetrate into deep waters and come close to undermining our hold on the oil resource in the Middle East. This, for me, constitutes the second time where we needed to lean on Islam to confront both Shiism in Iran and to confront the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. We have to understand the dynamics that brings us into the current context, that brings us to understanding who Osama bin Laden is,